It's good to be full of the joy of the Lord when you're talking about the false identity of the carnal man. Oh. Well, the false identity, the carnal nature, one of the aspects of this false identity that is very, very fundamental is that it is an independent thinking and behaving identity, independent from God. Because Adam and Eve chose to reject God and to listen to the creature rather than their creator, to honor the creature rather than to honor their creator, they stepped into this delusion. And so the false identity will get you to do anything but turn to God. All the thoughts of the false identity turn man away from God, to depend on self and to worship anything but God, to worship themselves, to worship others, to worship the creation, to worship stuff, false idols that they make with their hands, anything but God. And so it's independent in its thinking, and it serves to turn man's whole attitude and whole emphasis on doing and living life and being your own God, making your own decisions, choosing the way that you want to go, as though God doesn't exist, as though God isn't there. Meanwhile, in actual fact, he very much is. But another aspect of this false identity, funnily enough, is that it's trying to get to God, but by its own way, not by God's way, by its own way, coming up with its own ideas, its own patterns, its own thoughts. And this is where religion all comes from. Every religion is based in trying, by man's own effort, by this false identity, patterns of thinking independently of God, to get to God and to get God's acceptance that way. But now this false identity will never have God's acceptance because it has been condemned. Nevertheless, in its deceitful deception, it still tries to make its way to God. It still tries to be accepted by God. It doesn't want to believe that it's not accepted by God. And so out of this comes something else, which is called striving. This false identity is constantly striving, whether it's striving to get God, to get to God, or whether it's striving to please itself or to gain favor from men, to gain something from others. It's always, whether it's striving to get its own acceptance, whether it's striving to get acceptance from others, whether it's striving to get the acceptance of God, it's always in a striving mode. Why? Because it can't be accepted. Nevertheless, it's in a deception and it's trying to be accepted. And so this is where all striving comes from. You know, and Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. It's a completely different thing to be in a false identity, because you're in a place that's out of order, and you're trying to strive to get somewhere. But you're not going to get there without God. So, and this striving can affect Christians because of the fact that they don't understand what happened to their carnal man. They don't understand what the false identity is and how that false identity was dealt with by God. And so there's a mixture, and there's this striving still continuing, and it can show itself in efforts to please God, such as, striving if I fast 5 days a week, or if I pray 2 hours a day, and all these things based on if I do something, I am going to get to God. I'm going to get his favor. But the truth is we have his favor. The truth is we have been accepted by God. The truth is we are loved with an everlasting love by God. It's just the false identity that God hates. It's just the false identity that he has judged and condemned. Now, out of this whole idea of independence comes all forms not only of religion, but all forms of attitudes to try and gain some sort of self-aggrandizement. And it does this by what the world is founded on, which is competition, comparison, judging, and criticizing. Have you ever noticed that? The whole of the foundation of society is based on these things. Because if the carnal nature and the false identity can give itself value, which it's always trying to do, even though it's not going to have value because God has judged it, always trying to give itself value. It's living in a deception, in a delusion. And so if it can prove that it's better than someone, if it can compete and be better through competition, if it can compare itself and be better than someone else, if it can achieve more than someone else or than the world's record is, it gives itself value. If it can judge another and bring judgment against another, it gives itself value. If it can criticize another, it gives itself value. If it can put another down, it boosts itself up. And so all these are aspects of the false identity that's always trying to give itself value. And another thing it always tries to do is it defend itself. That false identity will defend itself, it will justify to the hilt, it will blame shift, and it will take vengeance out of itself against its enemies, because it's always trying to protect itself. Why would it try to protect itself? Because it's in deception, and the truth about it is that it's been judged, and so there's no need for it to protect itself. It's already been condemned. Now, another aspect about this carnal false identity is that the aspect of condemnation is very ingrained in it. And what it does is the spirit of condemnation is in the false identity. And so thoughts to condemn are ingrained in it, whether it's to condemn yourself or whether it's to condemn others. That spirit of condemnation is very rooted because why? God condemned it. And so it's enmeshed in the false identity. Thank God, that dirty. That's why God said all our righteousness is like filthy rags. Because this false identity is like a dirty scumbag. Oh, and the world is constantly trying to fix it. Because the world, until we discover that God has dealt with this, this is what the good news is about, telling people that God has dealt with that false identity. Helping people to see that false identity that God has dealt with, and to see that they are loved and valued with an extreme love. This is what the whole good news is about. And until that, so that false identity was condemned, that scumbag was condemned, thank God, by God. And it's filthy rags. It was filthy rags to God. Whereas Adam and Eve, before they stepped into that, were clothed in the glory. Now they're clothed in filthy rags. Now man outside of God is clothed in filthy rags. It's not funny, but it's only funny to realize that God, in His goodness, has made a way for us to be free from all that false identity has to do with. So that there doesn't need to be any striving. So that you don't need to prove yourself. So that you don't need to prove yourself to yourself. You don't need to try and get value. You don't need to do anything. And so that to be accepted, and so that there's no condemnation, so that you don't live in condemnation. Of course, this false identity is rooted in fear and shame. And so shame and fear are also enmeshed in the false identity. Whereas God loves us and He wants to pour love into us, which casts out fear. And He wants to pour in His value to us because He values us so much that He even gave His Son Jesus for us. So that we don't have condemning thoughts, so that condemnation is no part of us because we've come out of that false identity into the reality that we're so loved. We're so loved. And Jesus came and proved that love while the world was still living in that false identity.